Welcome to Relationship Real Talk, Live the Lives podcast. For over 20 years, we've been dedicated to strengthening marriages and families through relationship education. Our core goals are to reduce the Florida divorce rate by 50% by 2029, to increase the marriage rate, and reduce teen pregnancy and out-of-wedlock births. For more information about us, you can visit us at livethelife.org. All right, everyone, welcome back to Relationship Real Talk. I'm Ashley, and I'm joined with some special guests today. We have Richard Albertson and our friend Brad. So, Richard, I'll let you introduce Brad.
Absolutely. Well, we've been all over the place today, having a great time here in Tallahassee. But Dr. Brad Wilcox is the professor of sociology and the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. He's also the Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and he is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. So this guy is very widely respected. He's probably the top marriage and family scholar in the country, and we're just very fortunate to have him here today in Florida visiting. And his latest book is called Get Married. And Brad points out the national data that shows that getting married and forging a strong family is the best way to build a prosperous, meaningful, and happy life. So you want me to jump right on it? You have any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brad, welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you on.
Great to be here, Ashley.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So start us off with some questions, Richard.
Well, yeah, I have a bunch of them. One of them is just the idea that the institution of marriage is under attack, and it's been under attack for a long time, and from every direction. And so we're getting hammered from every side, and from the pop culture. It's not just pop culture; it's also academia, the elites. They're hostile to marriage, and in this corner we have Brad Wilcox and Get Married, and in this corner over here we have all these other voices in our culture, and so that are hostile to marriage. So where is that coming from?
So I think it's coming from a number of different places, Richard. I think part of the story here is that our culture and elites especially are prioritizing kind of an individualistic, or in more colloquial terms, kind of a me first mindset. I mean, they're used to kind of making choices for themselves on their own terms. They're reluctant to embrace institutions that in any way can kind of constrain their choices and kind of reinforce their obligations to things besides their own kind of agenda items. I think that's part of it, is kind of this individualism in the culture. I think too, we've moved obviously in a more secular direction. And so that means that kind of marriage, which has often religious connotations, is seen as less important. We're a much richer society. We're the richest society ever known to mankind, And I think with affluence, people kind of are less inclined to think about, the importance of marriage and kinship. They're more likely to think that they kind of do things on their own when they want to and how they please. I think too, we're seeing as well a kind of a progressive vision that assumes that every kind of new development in the relationship space, is good. That it should be baptized as new. That the arc of history is bending towards a better place, and that we need not kind of revisit or appreciate older traditions that have long sustained our marriages and families. So I think that kind of progressive ethos is also part of the challenge. And again, some things, there are some things that are better about marriage and family today. Men are much more engaged if they're married to one of their kids. That's an important caveat. With their kids than was the case for my grandparents' generation. That's a good thing. But we have, I think, in important ways, lost a lot of the wisdom from the past. And we can think of, examples, just to give you one kind of concrete idea to hang your hat on this one. When it comes to money, a lot of people are being told today, in this more individualistic, egalitarian, progressive spirit, you should have his and hers accounts in your marriage. That's the way to organize your money, that you shouldn't kind of merge your accounts and kind of keep a common purse, so to speak. And yet we know that couples who are keeping their money together with joint accounts, are much more likely to be flourishing than couples who have two separate accounts as their primary way to organize their money. And they're also less likely to get divorced. We even have good experimental evidence. Actually, there's a study out from Indiana that tells us that couples who are newlywed and randomly assigned to joint accounts versus separate accounts, the ones assigned to the joint accounts are doing much better in the first 2 years of marriage than those who were assigned to separate accounts. So the point is that there are a lot of different forces out there in the culture that are kind of basically undercutting a more familistic or family first mindset, undercutting kind of the appreciation for tradition. and undercutting also a more kind of communitarian, small c, approach that is more conducive to good marriages. And so we've got work cut out for us, basically.
We really do. And you've got Andrew Tate on the other hand of the spectrum.
Sure.
And he's, the people yelling and screaming and making all the noise seem to get all the attention. And, a lot of the messages that he say are totally against marriage. It's against women, that we don't even need marriage anymore. And I mean, women should be controlled and used and abused and cast aside. And those louder voices seem to be dominating everywhere. And it's not just the pop culture, but it's also mainline newspapers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic. There's all these articles constantly attacking marriage. And it's just hard for me to understand why I guess I can kind of get it on the pop culture side because, marriage kind of gets in the way of, I just want to, have fun and don't want anyone telling me what to do. But on the other side, you would think some of those folks would know better because the research doesn't really back up some of the things that they say in their articles. And those are mainstream publications. So how do we fight it on both ends of that spectrum?
See, I think on the pop cultural side, it's harder because people are often kind of living in the moment. They're not looking at sort of the longer term effects of what they're doing. So and you can see that on any number of, video games now, music videos, pop cultural shows and movies. But on the elite score, I think, I published my book, Get Married, in February. We had Melissa Kearney in September of last year publishing her book, The Two-Parent Privilege.
Yep.
We've got Rob Henderson, who published his book on his difficult life being raised in an adoptive home in California, also this spring. He's just a newly minted psychologist from Cambridge University, but really tough, background and impressive rise on his part. In our own different ways, we're all kind of like beating the drum that marriage and the two-parent family matter for kids and for adults and for
it still matters.
Yes, they still matter. And so I think we've all in different ways gotten a lot of good attention. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, PBS NewsHour, just the Atlantic, kind of you name it. And so I think there is, at least right now, a bit of an opening
Hallelujah.
where some, elites in both the academy and in the media are kind of like
a little more receptive.
Yeah, grudgingly admitting, acknowledging, or in some cases more enthusiastically that this is, marriage and family are really important institutions. And we need to think about how do we kind of reverse this dramatic decline, both in marriage and in childbearing that is now kind of rolling across a lot of countries, including the United States.
Well, I think it's very interesting too, how you're kind of talking about, it's not that we're trying to improve on something we know works. We've kind of just turned the other way and tried something completely different. And so that's just bearing out that it just doesn't work. We need to improve on what we know works and work within that system. So you have the book, it's called Get Married.
Right.
But I would say a lot of the younger people would say, why get married? So can you answer that question, why get married?
Yeah, so I have a chapter in the book on kind of the myth of the sort of solo, flyer, but this idea that kind of, flying solo is the way to go today. As I think a lot of younger adults think that just sort of not putting a ring on it, it's better, just keep your options open, keep your choices kind of available for you to pick in terms of your pathway through life and relationships. And what I would say is, look, we are hardwired to connect. We're social animals, to use Aristotle's terminology. We're meant to bond with someone else, basically, most of us, and just at every level, the sort of the biological, the emotional, the social, the cultural, having the benefit of a spouse and then kids usually after that is, just incredible. And, so just to kind of give you one example of how this plays out biologically, and then I'll give you an example of how it plays out, emotionally and financially. I think we've probably heard this idea that marriage domesticates men. And, you think about, it's just, maybe it's the girlfriend or the wife, or it's the culture. And yeah, it's all that to some extent. And when I've raised the point, there's some more progressive when they're like, that I resent the idea that I have to like fix the guy. I'm like, no, I'm like, actually more, it's just like that when you get married as a man, like you're kind of expecting yourself to kind of like become more responsible and to be more attentive to the woman in your life. And, there's a lot of it's like just, a personal thing, but there's also a physiological piece, which is fascinating. We're learning more about this now. And they've done a study in the Philippines looking at how when men are living with someone in a sexual relationship, their testosterone level goes down. If it's, their in-person relationship, coercive relationship. Then when they have their first kid, their testosterone level goes down even more. And so there's just a way in which marriage and family at the biological level are really domesticating men in ways that kind of make them settle down, become more like, pro-social, more responsible oftentimes. And that's actually, it's good for guys to have that transition, most of us, So that's a biological point. Financially, there's just no question that men who are married earn between 10 and 25% more than their peers who aren't married. And they're much more prudent in how they spend their money. And so they end up in their 50s with 10 times the assets as their never married male peers. And there's just no question that for the average guy financially, you're just in a much better spot if you put a ring on it and stay married. So that's an important financial point to make to young men today, for instance, but women benefit financially too. And then on the sort of emotional or happiness side, what we see is that for both women and men, they're almost twice as likely to be very happy with their lives if they're married with kids compared to being single and childless. And particularly for women today, there's just a lot of social media out there, a lot of academics out there who are kind of dissing on marriage for women, sort of saying, you're oppressed, things are not equal, et cetera, et cetera. Your job's going to suffer if you become married and have kids and da-da. And yes, there are sacrifices. Yes, not every marriage is 50-50. Most are not, obviously. But when you're netting all that out, basically what you still see is that women who are married with kids are the least lonely. They report the most meaningful lives, and they're the happiest women out there. And so on average, right? And of course there are exceptions, but on average. And so I think we just need to help people understand that we're kind of meant to live in community. And for most of us, that community is going to take the form of a spouse and kids. And so it's better to get at that than to kind of ignore it or to postpone it needlessly.
Well, a lot of the women, especially, will think that it is about getting my finances in order, and it's all about making money, and that's far more important to my happiness. If I just get that and kind of check that box and make sure I'm economically secure, then that's really the road. That's the road that we need to find. But that actually is not borne out by the data.
Right. So there was this crazy story in Bloomberg that was published, not too long ago that sort of said that women who are, kind of steering clear of marriage and motherhood are richer than women who are, getting married and having kids. And what completely overlooked it was that no, women who are married, stably married, on average are just way better off financially than women who are not married. So it is true that motherhood, it's expensive being a parent. So you do pay for your kids. But, there are some benefits to having children as well. But on the marriage front, there's just no question that married people are much better off financially, even, controlling for their background, education and professional experiences. So there's that. But I think that the more important point to make here is that when it comes to happiness, the paradox of happiness is that both, I think, living for others and then also developing a real set of skills. And some people it's going to be, maybe they're skilled at, at tennis or at piano or football, whatever it might be. But people take some profound pleasure though from mastering especially a difficult thing, and doing that well. And so you put those two things together, kind of living for others and mastering a difficult thing. And what you see is that both in terms of being a spouse and being a parent, you have the capacity to live for someone else or a number of people. And then you have the capacity to kind of master a something difficult, which is being a part of a family. It's hard. I don't want to sugarcoat this. Like, if you've been married 28 years, like I have, there are plenty of times when, we've had difficult days, chapters, months in our marriage. Same thing with our kids as well. So, I mean, it's not easy, but the sense of meaning that comes from having this long-term marriage and having, a bunch of kids is without compare. And then most of the time, I'm pretty happy to have a wife and to have a bunch of kids. And I know too, now that I'm 53, that a number of peers who are either unmarried or childless, or both, and it can be pretty rough road for them to walk without the benefit of a spouse or adult children. So I think what young adults don't appreciate is that we all age,
right?
And I mean, God willing, right?
Yeah, right.
Unless you die an early death, and by the time you hit your 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you don't have family, life is pretty tough, and
right.
they're not thinking like long term, like having a spouse and kids,
right?
And I have a 50-something friend who got divorced unwillingly, 3 beautiful daughters, and he's still single, and that's been tough, but he is so happy with his adult daughters, and as a grandfather, they just had 2 babies recently, 2 different daughters. I mean, so again, even though he suffered the pain of a divorce he did not seek and did not deserve, I mean, he is still now at this point in his life so happy to have his daughters flourishing and his new grandbabies, in the mix. So.
Yeah. Well, another myth I want to ask you about, and you could think of it as like a substitution myth. They want to substitute economics for a marriage. If I just do this, it'll replace that. I don't need it.
Right.
The other one is cohabitation, and this is a big one because it seems like the vast majority of young people are cohabiting, and the myth is it's just as good as, without all the headaches, without all the divorce, is just as good. It's equal to, if not better than. So confront the myth and tell us what the data says about that. And then the second one is with cohabitation that, I don't even need to get married. There's no point in getting married. And so how are the cohabiting folks doing it? And really help us understand, how do we address the topic without people feeling like we're just coming in to judge them, or we're just coming in to beat them up, and we're trying to make them feel bad. You're trying to shame us into saying we're shacking up, and you're looking down on us, and you're just trying to make us feel bad. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. So how do we send that message to a culture that's like very sensitive and has all these safe spaces and all these these places? How do we address that without hurting their feelings? Is that the wrong way to say it? Presenting it in the right way.
In a way it's driven by data, not by judgment.
Yeah. So how do we do that?
So I think, you got to think about what does the human heart want? And I think what the human heart wants, most of us, I think, is profound intimacy, where you are free to share, the most beautiful and painful things, the most meaningful, most difficult things with someone else, and also some stability, like there's a context of long-term commitment, and the reality is that there's only one sort of vehicle for that, kind of in a more romantic way, and that's marriage. I mean, the challenge with cohabitation is that it's not as committed as marriage. And so that inhibits being completely intimate, because there's always that gnawing worry in the back of your head that this person is going to reject me when I share something or when I do something that isn't perfect or whatever. And there isn't often what we call symmetrical commitment in a relationship.
Oh boy, is that
cohabiting.
True?
Usually the girl is more committed than the boy in the cohabiting relationship. The man is less committed than the woman. And so what we see is a lot more instability in cohabiting relationships. To be honest, the happiness is not that different, because I think part of it often too is that when you have a cohabiting relationship, it's like in the first flush of that romantic, intense connection, and there's still kind of it's all fresh and novel. But once they hit the tough
once that
times,
wears off,
they're much more likely to land in trouble, either where there's a cycle of fighting and whatever else, or one party just leaves.
And after all, we're not married, so I can leave now. So and this was the whole point, so I don't have to have a nasty divorce now. I just pack up my stuff and move out of the apartment or whatever. Right,
exactly. So it just doesn't offer the same degree of intimacy and stability as marriage does. And marriage is just also a way, of kind of recognizing that there's a social dimension to our relationships. a lot of Americans think we're kind of like lone rangers, like we're just kind of doing everything on our own or with one other person, our partner. But the reality is that no, as Aristotle said, we're social animals, And so when you get married, you're standing up in front of your family and your
That's right.
friends,
That's right.
as opposed to cohabiting, where you're just kind of like walking in with, a couple of suitcases or whatever else it might be. And you're making a public commitment to be there, for someone else, with someone else, to stand with them. And yes, marriage is not as, stable as it was 50 years ago, but it's still way more committed and way more stable than cohabitation is, and has been in recent decades. So the public and ceremonial character of marriage, even secular marriages, is culturally distinctive in what it signifies compared to just kind of, bringing your stuff into someone's apartment and just, sharing.
I'm here for as long as I want to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Until you make me mad.
Yeah. And I think it's fun. Well, not fun, but when I talk in my class, I talk about how will you marry me is a question that says, basically, I'm willing to risk everything. Marriage is inherently known to be this big thing. So I'm willing to risk everything with you. Will you move in with me says, I don't think you're going to make it.
Right.
And I'm going to test you out. Right. So it inherently says, I'm not willing to risk it all with you.
Right.
I'm willing to risk something, but not really a lot.
Right.
So that it's an inherent difference. And when I say it like that, people are like, yeah, that is kind of true. So it kind of makes sense to them then.
Right.
But you talked about earlier when we were talking at lunch, talking about how when you have that desire to cohabitate, it's kind of probably born from, okay, I saw someone else's marriage maybe not work. So can you talk to being sensitive to people's hurt and people's pain, but also realizing that maybe we need to change moving forward. Maybe we need to be the ones that break that cycle.
So it's interesting. You do see that people whose parents have gotten divorced are more likely to cohabit than people whose parents did not get divorced. And so I think there is an understandable desire to kind of kick the tires, make sure that this is going to go the distance, unlike mom and dad. And that makes perfect sense. I get it. Right. But it's just that the reality is that that's not a wise strategy. The better strategy is, yes, get to know someone. You can go, volunteer at the local Girls and Boys Club. That's a good way to see how someone really, put someone in, the mix with 12 6-year-olds.
Oh yeah.
You'll learn a lot about that person pretty darn quick, a lot more than you will, in other contexts, and see how they treat their family members, see how they treat what are their friends like. So there are ways you can kind of, I think, make really good judgments about people that don't require you to live together. And I think what's, valuable about not living together is it really gives people opportunities to have some serious and hard conversations, make sure that they're on the same page when it comes to marriage. And then also it sets something out in the future for them to aspire to, which is distinctive and important and valuable. That is our married family life. And just also kind of basically signals to themselves that once they move into this new relationship, it's we're all in. We're not as a couple often as it's kind of more have a provisional, kind of commitment where we're together so as long as our love shall last. And one example that's is about money. Cohabiting couples tend to have separate accounts, understandably, because they're not fully committed to each other.
Right.
And then the problem is when they move in together as a married couple, or they keep living together as a married couple, they often keep their accounts separate.
Right.
And that's not a good way to start the marriage. By contrast, people who just, move in together after the wedding ceremony, much more likely to have joint accounts financially and to benefit. But it's just kind of an example of the way in which cohabitation often gets people off on the wrong foot, because they're thinking about their relationship in a much more me first way and kind of trying to protect themselves.
Right.
But then if they carry that mentality into their marriage, they're more likely to suffer, because the best marriages are ones where people are all in and they've, as the Roman generals would often they burn the bridge behind the soldiers.
That's right.
So the soldiers knew there's only one way out of here, either in there's I guess 2 ways out of this. either a body bag or victory. And so they're going to aim for victory.
Right.
Whereas if you have that bridge behind you, in time when the marriage gets tough, you can just cross that bridge and exit that way.
Yep. Definitely. It's like Cortez when he came to Florida, he burned the ships. He burned all the boats and said, we're not going back to Europe. We're either make it or this is it.
Die. Yep.
Yeah.
So I have two personal questions, unless you have any. Do you have any other book questions?
Oh, I have all kinds of questions.
Okay,
but
yeah.
keep going. That's okay. I never run out of
Well,
questions.
my first one is you are a professor, you are an author, you're a father, you're a husband, you have all of these roles. And just, quick plug, you have 9 children, which is incredible in and of itself. How do you prioritize having a healthy marriage for your children to see?
Sure. So I think one thing that we've done really since our older kids were little kids is we really try to do a date night on Friday or Saturday night. And so it's just a time for us to get away from the kids. And some of our friends, don't like rely upon babysitters, and we're like, no, I mean, we're discerning about who we would, pick for a babysitter, but
For sure.
But no, we're like, we definitely need to get out. And, so I think that's certainly been a mainstay to our marriage. We've also benefited from having my in-laws move to Charlottesville about 14 years ago.
Wow.
So in terms of helping, sometimes babysit for date nights, but also just sort of helping with, getting kids to school and back from school, and sports and back from sports. My in-laws have been incredibly helpful. And they've been married more than 50 years. So kind of just,
Wow.
having their example in the mix has been good for us as a couple. And we go to church most Sundays together. I mean, depends sometimes on,
Oh, for sure.
travel sports, but I hesitate to acknowledge, but so we're usually in church as a family together, with 3 generations, my in-laws, Danielle and me, and our kids. I think that's like important for our kids to see all that sort of, they know that their grandparents are, stably married for more than 50 years, and they expect mom and dad to kind of do likewise. And, so we hope that they're going to do likewise as well. That's, I think, part of the story. And, I think too, and divorce is not like, it's never been on the table, right? So we've had tough times, but it's always been kind of like, how we're going to work through this situation or this challenge or whatever the problem might be.
Failure's not an option.
Yeah.
Definitely.
We're going to do it.
Ultimate failure is not an option. Acknowledging that we do make mistakes, and that we have, we've had problems and issues at times. That's as every couple does, but divorce not like the exit plan. So.
Right.
Absolutely.
We're going to work on it. We're going to work around it. We're going to find a way to work through this and be stronger for having done it.
Yeah.
Well, I have this guy named Brad Wilcox who's done research on date nights and that they're actually good for you. And one of the things I'll say, sometimes we have our Hope Weekends, which is what we have for very distressed couples. These are folks that are in divorce court. This is one of the heaviest things that we do. And it's very gratifying because about 85% of those marriages make it and they tear up the divorce papers, which I love. So we say, and then on this end, we have date nights where it's fun, playful, stay connected, do fun things together, stay in touch and do those things that just make life worth living.
Sure.
I said, we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. It's better to do the date nights and keep that kind of going. So,
yeah, that's a really good point. So my last question would be, so you are both raising and kind of teaching the next generation. What do you think is like the number one message that they need to hear about relationships, marriage? What are the things that you want your kids to grow up and your students to know when they leave your sphere of influence?
I think the most important sort of lesson to learn is, and this is, I think, hard for at least many of us, certainly me, is that living for others, is the path to happiness, and that happiness is not directly pursued. And I talk in my book about kind of this idea of thinking about like a desert, and you're looking at, like, you're really thirsty, and there's like that mirage of the water on the desert's edge. So if you keep like chasing that mirage, you're just going to be completely thirsty the whole time. You're never going to find water. But if you were to follow like the route that winds its way through the desert, the appropriate route, so to speak, and you're not actually chasing water directly, you will come across, oases every, whatever it is, 10, 20 miles, whatever it might be. And it's the same thing kind of when it comes to life. If you're kind of directly pursuing, happiness, or, what you desire kind of in the moment, what you think is going to make you happy. And today it's often some kind of electronic opiate, like on social media or some kind of video game, or it's money or a job, or some kind of building your own brand thing where you think you're going to be like an influencer or something like that. Those things can bring short-term, satisfaction, but not really deep and abiding joy. And by contrast, if you are living for your spouse, living for your kids, living for your local community, it could be a church community, it could be some kind of, civic organization, and people are kind of embracing that spirit of generosity, of spirit in family and community, are much more likely to be thriving. Because again, we actually end up taking profound pleasure and joy from seeing other people flourish as a consequence of our own work or actions. So
That's really good.
Well, speaking of young people coming up and what you want them to learn and part of their education is one of the things we do in the middle schools and high schools is we do the sequence of success and the steps to success. That to me, that's easier to say. Steps to success is easier. But anyway, it's basically the four things is to get your education, whether it's high school, GED, trade school, whatever, college, get a job, and then get married, and then have children. In that order, the research, there's been so much research done on that for many decades, and it keeps saying the same thing, that this is the best way to really find that success, and which backs up the book, getting married, especially before you have kids. And that most of the young people that follow that, almost all of them are not in poverty. They find a way, either if they're in poverty, they get out of it, or they're more successful financially. So has the data changed on that? What's the latest on that? Is that still true? Because again, we're up against this myth that we don't want to tell the kids this because it's judgmental and it makes their parents feel judged, or it's and that's not the goal. That's never the goal, to pound on anybody and make someone feel bad. But don't we owe it to the young people to tell them this message? And is the data update us on the latest on the...
Yeah. So the sequence, this idea that kind of getting this high school degree, working full time in your 20s, and getting married before having kids, those three steps about education, work, and marriage, still incredibly predictive of realizing the American dream financially. Only 3%, as you were saying, of young adults who are in their late 20s and 30s who have done those three steps are going to be poor. And we find that when you kind of break it out by like whether you came from a poor family or African American or Hispanic or white, depending upon which of those groups you're talking about, it's more than 94% are basically going to steer clear of poverty. So this is a pathway that is meant for Americans from a wide range of backgrounds, and it just sort of reinforces this idea that education, work, and marriage help propel people forward into greater financial stability and security in ways that are super important. So that's I think worth mentioning to young adults, to kind of just give them some sense of their direction and purpose financially. But I also want to just sort of stress too that I was thinking about this sequence of success, or the success sequence, just to recognize that it's not just about money, it's also about kind of flourishing in other ways. And to just we know that education, work, and marriage are also linked to greater happiness too. So I want to be clear that the message is, it's primarily financial, but there are other kind of benefits that flow from education, work, and marriage.
Yeah, because this is the marriage piece, right?
Right,
When you
right.
get that, so for lots of reasons, it's not just economic. Although, hey, you would think that'd be a great motivator for someone if you're living in poverty. Shouldn't this be a neon flashing sign? Hey, do you want to get out of poverty? This is one of the best things. This is the best anti-poverty program in the history of our country, and yet 90% of middle school and high school kids have never heard of it.
Right.
And that's our challenge.
Right. But it's also too, I mean, you were kind of challenging me earlier today, rightly, about sort of the skills piece, right? And so I think there are a lot of people, who would like to be better educated, who would like to have a full-time job, who would like to be married, who would like to be out of poverty, right? But they don't have the skills and the experiences that would kind of give them the kind of the habits and the connections that would lead them to get a certain level of education and to work full time and to find a spouse as well. So part of the challenge too is equipping young adults with the kinds of skills and the mindset. That makes it more likely they'll succeed both in marriage and family, but also when it comes to, these other domains of education work as well.
Amen. Well, we have our work cut out for us, but I can say, and you worked in schools, and you know this to be true. The kids, even in Gaston County and some of the poorest county in Florida, those kids eat this up.
Every county, yeah.
If Abdul was sitting here right now, he says, "Oh yeah," I mean, we need to introduce you to Abdul on our staff because man, they eat this stuff up and they're hungry for it. They're hungry for someone to show them the truth, and they get so many wrong messages. And it's hard to, okay, what's authentic? What's real? Who can we trust? What can we rely on? We want to be that voice in there to help them, connect those dots and help them see that and have a more clear path.
Well, especially when, not even just the middle schoolers and high schoolers. I work with a lot of college young girls, young boys, and even just citing some of the statistics you were talking about with the cohabitation and other crazy things about, how sexual relationships affect a relationship and all of that kind of stuff. And they've just never been told the truth.
Right.
So it's eye-opening. So it's so true. We have so much work to do just telling them the truth. Right. Based on fact, not based on judgment, not based on, not that it isn't based in scripture, but it's not, hey, this is what, scripture says, so you should do it. It's also
the research,
born out in research. And so I think you make a really good point that there's a lot of work to be done, but I don't think it's an insurmountable task.
Right. No, I think, and it is one thing that's sort of, I think, interesting about the work that I'm doing with Institute for Family Studies and my colleagues there, like Dr. Wendy Wang, is that like most of our data analysis is based upon publicly accessible data sets, right? So the General Social Survey is run by the University of Chicago every 2 years, typically with money from the feds. We look at what's called the Analyst Y97, another federally funded survey as well. We look at the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census. But each of these three surveys is accessible to anyone with a computer. Yep. And so if you don't like what I'm saying,
look it up yourself.
You can play with the numbers yourself. And I use the GSS. It's like the gold standard for social attitudes, in America. And I found that the best predictor of happiness, in life was a good marriage. Now I looked at sexual frequency. I looked at religious attendance. I looked at self-rated health. I looked at money, education, job satisfaction, all the things that I could think of that would predict happiness better than a good marriage. None of those factors came close to predicting global happiness like a good marriage did. So, go at it. But I think the data is there, and people who are skeptical of this idea that marriage matters, I think need to look at the data. Now we can debate the main, I think, question that a smart critic would make of my work is, well, is it really the case that marriage per se makes people better off financially and emotionally, or is it just that the kinds of people today who get married have more education, more money, more religious faith, whatever else, and that these things, not marriage per se, is what matter? But I think that's part of the story. But I think also too, even when you compare like religious Americans who are married versus not married, you find the religious married Americans are better. If you look at rich people who are married versus rich people who are not married, you find the rich people who are married are happier. So it just seems like, the data is pretty strong. There's a real premium that attends to marriage, for instance, when it comes to loneliness, meaning, money, and happiness, where the folks who are married tend to do better. And so I just want more Americans, more kids, especially young adults, to realize that that's the case and that they should reorient their lives accordingly.
Amen.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We hope you go out and buy his amazing book, Get Married by Dr. Brad Wilcox. It is an amazing book. I am almost done with it, so I've really enjoyed it. But we thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Remember, we are now offering free classes in Florida through our Healthy Marriage Initiative grant. If you are interested, check out livethe.life.org/aim. If you are military and you are interested in learning more about this program, you can reach out to us by emailing ashley@livethe.life.org. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you feel educated, encouraged, and empowered to thrive in whatever relationship you're in.